The foreclosure notice felt like a sliver of ice against Abigail's calloused palm. 3 months. 90 days to vacate the land her father had broken his back to clear, the small sod house he had built with his own hands. The paper was crisp, official, and utterly indifferent to the sweat and tears that had soaked the soil for 2 generations. Her father was gone 5 years now, taken by a fever that burned through him in a week. Her husband, gone 1. No fever, just a note on the table. No child support. No explanation. Just gone. Leaving her with a failed crop, a mountain of debt, and her 80-year-old mother, Martha, whose mind was still as sharp as a shard of flint but whose body was slowly betraying her. Abigail had worked until her hands bled, taking in mending, selling what few eggs her scrawny chickens produced, but it was like trying to fill a well with a thimble. The debt was a living thing, a predator that had stalked them for months and was now closing in for the kill. She looked up at the vast, unforgiving sky, the sun a merciless hammer in the heat-bleached blue. Desperation was a physical taste in her mouth, metallic and sour. That was when she saw the wagon. Her mother sat proudly on the buckboard, her back ramrod straight, handling the reins of their weary old mule with a defiant grip. Behind the wagon, hitched by a series of heavy chains, was the most ludicrous, most heartbreaking sight Abigail had ever witnessed. A train car. Not a functioning one, but a derelict husk, a long-forgotten passenger carriage of a bygone era. Its paint was peeling in great leprous sheets, revealing rust-pocked steel beneath. The windows were either shattered or clouded with the grime of ages. It looked like a beached whale, immense, pathetic, and utterly useless. Abigail felt a cold dread snake through her, colder than the fear of the foreclosure. "Mama," she whispered as the bizarre procession groaned to a halt. Martha climbed down from the buckboard with a stiffness that pained Abigail to see. She ignored the question in her daughter's eyes, her gaze fixed on the monstrosity she dragged home. $500, Martha said, her voice raspy but firm. It was every last cent they had. The money Abigail had painstakingly saved for a final, desperate appeal to the bank. The emergency fund tucked away for medicine. All of it. You spent all of it. Abigail's voice cracked. On this? It's ours, Martha stated, as if that explained everything. She patted the rusted flank of the train car. No one can take it from us. It's not land. It's property. We can live in it, live in it. The words echoed in the desolate quiet of their yard. Abigail looked from the cold finality of the notice in her hand to the rusted ruin before her, and a wave of nausea washed over her. Her mother, her sharp, practical mother, had finally been broken by their plight. She had traded their last hope for a heap of scrap metal. "Mama, what have you done?" The words were barely a breath, a whisper of pure despair against the prairie wind. Martha turned, and for the first time, Abigail saw the fierce, almost feral light in her mother's faded blue eyes. It wasn't madness. It was a gamble. The last, most desperate gamble of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I bought us a home, Abigail," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that defied all logic. "Now, help me unhitch it. We have work to do." The first week was a trial of dust and disillusionment. They were forced to abandon the sod house 2 days after the car's arrival, a grim procession of 2 women carrying their meager belongings, a few quilts, a cast-iron skillet, a box of chip plates, to their new, metallic shelter. The interior of the train car smelled of decay, of mice and rust and the slow, patient rot of forgotten things. The velvet on the seats had been shredded by nesting animals, the stuffing spilling out like pale guts. A fine layer of ochre dust coated every surface, stirred into choking clouds with every movement. Abigail worked with a grim, silent fury, scrubbing, sweeping, and hauling out debris. Each motion was fueled by a deep, simmering anger at her mother's folly, at the sheer hopelessness of their situation. This wasn't a home, it was a tomb on wheels. Yet Martha seemed undeterred. Each morning, she would be up with the sun, her old bones creaking in protest, as she meticulously polished a small section of tarnished brass fitting or painstakingly tried to patch a tear in the faded, water-stained wallpaper. She saw something Abigail could not. She saw potential where Abigail saw only ruin. "This was a fine car once," Martha would say, running a wrinkled hand over the grimy wood paneling. "A private car. Belonged to someone important." "You can feel it," Abigail would just grunt in response, her arms aching from scrubbing the filthy floorboards. The floor was solid oak, thick and heavy, but stained and scarred by decades of neglect. She worked on her hands and knees, the lye soap biting into the raw skin of her knuckles. It was on the fourth day, in the far corner of the main compartment, that her rhythm was broken. As she pushed her brush forward with all her weight, a section of the floor gave a low, resonant groan that was different from the usual creaks. It felt hollow. She stopped, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. She pressed down on the board again with her hand. It moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. "Mama," she called out, her voice tight. Martha came over, her movement slow and deliberate, her eyes missing nothing. Abigail pointed. "This board. It's loose together." They examined it. There were no visible hinges, no handle. It looked identical to the planks around it, but when they pushed and prodded at the edges, they found the seam. It had been cut with surgical precision, the grain of the wood expertly matched to conceal the line. Using the tip of her father's old hunting knife, Abigail carefully worked at the edge, prying it up. The board resisted, then lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air, revealing not dirt and ballast, but a dark, rectangular cavity. It was a hidden compartment. A cold thrill, part fear and part hope, shot through Abigail. For a moment, she forgot the foreclosure, the hunger, the suffocating dust. There was only the dark, waiting space beneath the floor. Martha knelt beside her, her breath coming in short, shallow puffs. Her hand, gnarled with age, found Abigail's shoulder and squeezed. "Someone desperate enough," Martha whispered, her voice a low hum. "Someone brave enough. Someone who would care." Abigail didn't understand what she meant, but she felt the weight of the words. She reached into the darkness, her fingers brushing against something cold, smooth, and unyielding. It was a box. The box was made of heavy-gauge steel, tarnished with age but showing no sign of rust. It was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, secured with 2 sturdy latches but no lock. It was surprisingly heavy, requiring both of them to lift it out of the compartment and set it on the dusty floor. For a long moment, they just stared at it, the silence in the car thick with unspoken questions. Abigail's mind raced with fantastical possibilities born of desperation: gold coins, jewelry, a rich man's hidden fortune. It had to be. Why else go to the trouble of building such a clever hiding place? Her hands trembled as she reached for the latches. They were stiff, protesting with a loud metallic snap that echoed in the enclosed space. She lifted the lid. The contents were not what she expected. There was no glint of gold, no sparkle of gems. Instead, the box was tightly packed with papers. Stacks of them, tied in neat bundles with twine. On top lay a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with handling. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over Abigail. It was just paper. Worthless documents from a forgotten life. All that hope, a fool's dream. "Just paper," she said, her voice flat. She slumped back on her heels, the brief flicker of excitement extinguished. But Martha leaned closer, her sharp eyes scanning the contents. She reached in with a steady hand and picked up the top bundle. She squinted at the topmost document. "This is no ordinary paper, child," she said, her voice low and intense. She handed it to Abigail. It was a property deed, written in elegant, looping script. The date was from 30 years prior. The name on the deed was for a large parcel of land on the other side of the county, land that Abigail knew belonged to the Harrison family, the wealthiest and most powerful family in the territory. But the name of the owner on this deed was not Harrison. It was Samuel Reed. Abigail frowned, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. She picked up another bundle. It contained bank ledgers, filled with columns of names and numbers meticulously recorded in black ink. She didn't understand what she was looking at, but the sheer volume of it, the careful organization, spoke of something important. Finally, she picked up the leather-bound book. It was a journal. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the deed, precise and clear. October 12, 1858, the entry began. I take possession of my private carriage today. A foolish expense, perhaps, but in my line of work, privacy is paramount. And security. I have commissioned a small modification to the floor, a space to hold items of a sensitive nature. My partner, Mr. Alastair Harrison, finds my caution amusing. He tells me I should learn to trust in the good nature of men. I find his optimism troubling. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Harrison. She looked at her mother, whose eyes were wide, reflecting the dawning, terrifying understanding that was beginning to form in Abigail's own mind. This wasn't a treasure chest. It was a box of secrets. And they had just opened it. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, casting long shafts of dusty light across the train car as Abigail's voice gave life to the words of a dead man. She read the journal aloud, her voice growing hoarse as the hours passed. Martha sat perfectly still on an overturned crate, her hands clasped in her lap, listening with an unnerving intensity. The story that unfolded from the pages was not one of adventure, but of quiet, methodical betrayal. Samuel Reed was not a gunslinger or an explorer. He was a banker, a custodian of trust. He and his partner, Alastair Harrison, had founded a land bank that held the savings and investments of hundreds of settlers, small families who had poured their life's work into the promise of the frontier. Samuel was the cautious one, the stickler for rules and records. Alastair was the face of the bank, charming, ambitious, and beloved by the community. But according to the journal, Alastair's charm was a mask for a deep and chilling avarice. November 5, 1858, Abigail read, her finger tracing the elegant script. I have confirmed my suspicions. The discrepancies in the ledgers are not errors. They are systematic. Alastair is skimming. Small amounts at first, from the largest accounts, easily dismissed as clerical mistakes. But the pattern is undeniable. He is treating the dreams of these good people as his personal treasury. The entries chronicled Samuel's growing horror as he secretly audited the books, cross-referencing his private copies of the ledgers, the very ones now sitting in the steel box, with the official records at the bank. He discovered a scheme of breathtaking audacity. Alastair Harrison was using the settlers' money to buy up vast tracts of land, defaulting on loans to his own bank, and then acquiring the foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar through a series of shell companies. He was building an empire on the ruins of the people who trusted him. The journal was filled with Samuel's anguish and his resolve. January 21, 1859. He knows that I know. I saw it in his eyes today. The bonhomie is gone, replaced by something cold. He offered me a share, a full partnership in his enterprise. He called it pragmatism. I called it theft. The conversation did not end well. I must act quickly. I have gathered all the proof, my ledgers, the original deeds he has falsified, and signed affidavits from 2 clerks he has tried to silence. It is all in the compartment. Tomorrow, I will take this car and attach it to the eastbound train. I will go to the territorial capital and present this to the marshals. Abigail paused, her throat tight. She looked at the date of the entry. February 3, 1859. She flipped to the next page. It was blank. And the next. All blank. That was the final entry. He never made it, Martha whispered into the heavy silence. The papers back then, she said, her memory stirring. When I was a girl, my father used to talk about it. The founding of the Harrison fortune. Alastair Harrison's partner, a man named Reed, died in a hunting accident. A terrible tragedy, they called it. His body was never properly recovered from a ravine. The truth settled over them, cold and heavy as a shroud. Samuel Reed hadn't died in an accident. He had been silenced. And this train car, this derelict shell they had bought out of desperation, was not just his private carriage. It was his final, desperate attempt to tell the truth. It was a witness, a tomb, and an archive of a monumental crime. The fortune that had made the Harrison family the unspoken kings of the territory was built on a foundation of theft and, almost certainly, murder. The next morning, a man came. He was not from the bank, nor was he from the town. He rode a fine horse and wore clean, well-fitting clothes that seemed out of place against the dusty backdrop of their predicament. He was tall and lean, with a face that was neither friendly nor overtly hostile, his eyes constantly moving, assessing everything. He dismounted and approached the train car, his boots making soft thuds in the dirt. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "My name is Clay. I represent a party who has an interest in historical railway artifacts." Abigail stood at the door of the car, her body forming a barrier. She held a heavy iron skillet in her hand, a flimsy defense that felt foolishly inadequate. "It's not for sale," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Clay smiled, a brief, practiced motion that didn't reach his eyes. "I haven't even made an offer. My employer is a collector. He's authorized me to offer you $1,000 for this car. A handsome profit on your investment, I believe double what her mother had paid. Enough to buy a small plot of land somewhere else, to start over." A week ago, she would have wept with gratitude. Now, the offer felt like an insult, a threat wrapped in currency. The timing was too perfect. Someone knew. Someone was worried. "I said, it's not for sale," Abigail repeated, lifting her chin. The man's smile faded. His gaze flickered from Abigail's face to the dark interior of the car behind her, as if he could see the steel box, the journal, the incriminating papers right through the walls. "Everything is for sale," he said softly. "It's just a matter of finding the right price. Perhaps you should reconsider." It would be wise. He tipped his hat, turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away. The encounter left Abigail trembling, a cold sweat on her skin despite the morning heat. The threat was no longer a 30-year-old ghost in a journal. It was here. It was real. That afternoon, she saw him again. A lone rider, sitting on his horse on a distant ridge, a dark silhouette against the bright sky, simply watching them. He made no move to approach, but his presence was a constant, unnerving pressure. "He knows," Abigail said to her mother, who was watching the figure from one of the grimy windows. "He doesn't know what we have," Martha corrected her gently. "Not for certain. But he knows this car belonged to Samuel Reed. And his employer is afraid of what might be in it." The name, which had been just a historical curiosity, now fell into place with chilling clarity. Alastair Harrison's partner. "Harrison," Abigail breathed. The man in the journal was Alastair Harrison. The richest man in the territory. His son, Thomas Harrison, runs everything now. The bank, the mines, half the politicians, the town they had just been driven from, the bank that held the note on their land, the very institution that was casting them out, was built on the crime they had uncovered. They were not just poor, they were victims of a generational injustice that had finally, impossibly, washed up at their feet. The scale of it was dizzying. They were two destitute women in a rusted metal box against the most powerful man in their world. The journal felt heavier now, not with paper and ink, but with the weight of a terrible and dangerous obligation. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in Abigail's stomach that tightened every time a shadow fell across the doorway or the prairie wind rattled the car's frame. The distant figure of Clay became a regular feature of the landscape, a silent, menacing sentinel. They couldn't stay here. They were exposed, vulnerable. Hiding the box was not enough, the truth it contained had to be brought into the light, just as Samuel Reed had intended. Clasping the worn leather journal in a burlap sack, Abigail knew she had to go into town. Not their old town, where every official and business owner was likely in Thomas Harrison's pocket, but to Prescott, the territorial capital, a day's ride away if she pushed their old mule hard. Martha insisted on staying. "Someone has to guard the rest of it," she said, her hand resting on the steel box, which they had hidden again in its compartment, the floorboard replaced. "He won't harm an old woman. It would draw too much attention." The argument was frail, but Abigail saw the iron resolve in her mother's eyes and knew it was useless to protest. The ride to Prescott was fraught with anxiety. Every rider she passed on the trail seemed to be watching her, every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats behind her. She arrived in the bustling capital late in the afternoon, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds. She needed a lawyer, but who could she trust? Harrison's influence could easily reach this far. She walked the dusty streets, scanning the shingles hanging outside the buildings. Harrison and Dunn, legal partners, T.J. Miller, attorney for the Western mining conglomerate, they all seemed connected, interwoven with the fabric of power she was trying to fight. Then she saw it, a small, unassuming office tucked between a bakery and a telegraph station. The shingle was plain, the paint slightly faded. Arthur Finch, attorney at law, for it seemed small enough, independent enough, to be safe. Mr. Finch matched his office. He was a man of middle years, with thinning hair, spectacles, and a suit that was clean but well-worn. He looked more like a clerk than a crusader. He listened patiently as Abigail, perched nervously on the edge of a chair, laid out the story. She spoke in a low, urgent voice, starting with the foreclosure, her mother's desperate purchase, the discovery of the compartment. She saw skepticism in his eyes, the polite, weary look of a man who has heard too many tales of imagined fortunes. It was only when she finally pulled the journal from the sack and placed it on his desk that his expression changed. "The car belonged to a man named Samuel Reed," she said. "He kept this journal." At the mention of the name, Finch stilled. A subtle but profound shift occurred in his posture. He leaned forward, his professional detachment dissolving. He reached for the journal with a hand that was not quite steady, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "Samuel Reed," he repeated, his voice hushed. He opened it, his eye scanning the first page, the familiar, elegant script. He looked up at Abigail, and the skepticism was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded emotion. "Samuel Reed was my mother's uncle," he said, his voice thick. "My great-uncle. He disappeared when my mother was a little girl. The family was told he ran off, that he'd stolen money from his bank. His name was disgraced. It has been a shadow over our family for my entire life." He looked down at the journal, then back at Abigail, his eyes shining with a mixture of grief and a dawning, ferocious hope. "All these years," he whispered. "We never knew." In that moment, Arthur Finch transformed from a disinterested professional into a man with a deeply personal stake in the truth. He was not just an ally, he was a fellow heir to Samuel Reed's stolen legacy. The weight of the secret now felt shared, but the danger had intensified. Arthur Finch, energized by a lifetime of quiet family shame, worked with a feverish intensity. He read the entire journal, cross-referenced the names in the ledgers with old territorial records, and examined the deeds. He confirmed that the land described in Samuel's documents now formed the core of the Harrison estate. The evidence was overwhelming, a perfect time capsule of a crime. "He cannot let this stand," Finch said, pacing his small office. "Thomas Harrison is not his father. Alastair was a predator, but he built the empire. Thomas was born into it. He's a gentleman, a pillar of society. This truth would not just cost him his fortune, it would obliterate his name, his entire identity." As if summoned by Finch's words, the invitation arrived the next day. A crisp envelope delivered by a courier, requesting the presence of Miss Abigail and her legal counsel at the offices of the Harrison mining conglomerate. It was not a request, it was a summons. Harrison's office was the antithesis of Finch's. It was a vast, cavernous room paneled in dark, polished mahogany, with a thick carpet that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. A huge window looked out over the growing city, a view that belonged to a king. Thomas Harrison sat behind a desk the size of a small carriage. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with silvering hair and his father's charming smile. But his eyes were cold, calculating. Clay, the man from the ridge, stood silently by the door, his presence a stark reminder of the power Harrison wielded. "Miss Abigail, Mr. Finch." "Thank you for coming," Harrison began, his tone smooth and patronizing. "I understand you've come into possession of some old memorabilia belonging to my father's former partner." He did not deny it. He leaned back in his chair, forming a steeple with his fingers. "History is a messy business. Partnerships dissolve, tempers flare, misunderstandings occur. My father and Mr. Reed had a falling out. It was a great tragedy. Your father stole everything from him, and then he killed him, Finch stated, his voice ringing with newfound courage. Harrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. Strong words, Mr. Finch. Words that are impossible to prove after 30 years. All you have is the journal of a disgruntled man. We have his ledgers, Abigail said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet but clear in the large room. And his deeds. We have his story. Harrison turned his cold eyes on her. He saw not a lawyer, but a poor, desperate woman. He saw a problem that could be solved with money. I am a sentimental man, Harrison said, opening a drawer in his desk. For the sake of closing this sad chapter of my family's history, I am prepared to be generous. I will purchase your train car and all its contents. Let's say $20,000. A finder's fee. Enough to ensure you and your mother live in comfort for the rest of your days. It was a fortune. More money than Abigail had ever dreamed of. It was the easy way out. The safe way out. She could take it, disappear, and forget she ever saw that steel box. She thought of Samuel Reed's last, hopeful entry in his journal. She thought of her mother, polishing the tarnished brass with her gnarled hands, believing in the car's hidden importance. She met Harrison's gaze. This isn't for sale, she said. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Harrison's mask of civility crumbled, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. His smile vanished. I suggest you reconsider, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with menace. You are a woman alone, with an elderly mother. It would be a terrible shame if some misfortune were to befall you. Accidents happen. Fires start. Things get lost. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But Abigail felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective certainty. We are not alone, she said, glancing at Finch. And we are not for sale. Leaving Harrison's office was like surfacing from a deep, cold body of water. The air on the street felt warmer, the sunlight brighter. They had crossed a line. The private war of nerves was about to become a public battle. Finch, no longer just a small-town lawyer but a man on a mission, moved swiftly. He filed a formal claim against the Harrison estate with the territorial court, petitioning for the restitution of assets stolen from the original depositors of the land bank, with Abigail and Martha named as the agents of discovery. The filing was a cannon shot, its report echoing through the capital. The story was irresistible: 2 destitute women and a reclusive lawyer against the mighty Harrison dynasty, all based on a 30-year-old secret found in a derelict train car. Newspapers from as far as St. Louis sent reporters. The case became a spectacle. Harrison's response was immediate and brutal. His lawyers filed countersuits, accusing Abigail of fraud and Finch of professional malpractice. They publicly painted Samuel Reed as an embezzler who had fled with the bank's money, and his journal as a self-serving fiction created to cover his crimes. The pressure on Abigail became personal and terrifying. The surveillance intensified. Clay was no longer a distant figure, he was a constant, unnerving presence. One evening, as Abigail was driving the mule and wagon back from fetching supplies, a freight wagon thundered past far too close, forcing her off the road, the wheels of her wagon splintering in a ditch. It was no accident. She was left shaken but unharmed, the warning clear. Another night, they were woken by the smell of smoke. A small fire had been set at the far end of the train car, a deliberate act of arson that they managed to extinguish with their precious water barrels before it could take hold. Fear was a constant, metallic taste in Abigail's mouth. She began to doubt herself, to wonder if the $20,000 had been the right choice. One evening, as she sat patching a quilt by lantern light, a shadow fell across the door. It was Clay. He stood there, not menacingly, but with a strange weariness in his posture. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He wants the journal, Clay said, his voice flat. Just the journal. He'll double the offer. 40,000. You walk away, and I walk away. Abigail looked up at him, her hand stilling on the quilt. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the distaste for the work he was doing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "It's a job," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Is it?" she pressed. "Or is it just easier than standing up for what's right? That book, it's not about money. It's about a man who tried to do the right thing and died for it. Your boss wants to kill him a second time. Erase him completely. Are you going to help him do that?" She wasn't angry. Her voice was filled with a profound, sorrowful disappointment that seemed to strike him more than any threat could. He looked at her, at the patched quilt in her lap, at the stark poverty of her surroundings, and then at the unyielding integrity in her eyes. He saw a courage he did not possess. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away into the darkness, disappearing from the ridge for good. He had made his choice. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed to the rafters. Every seat was taken, and a crowd of onlookers spilled out onto the courthouse steps. It felt as if the entire territory was holding its breath. Thomas Harrison sat at the plaintiff's table with a team of 3 slick, expensive-looking lawyers, looking composed and confident. On the other side sat Abigail, her mother Martha beside her, and Arthur Finch, who looked small and outmatched but held a quiet, determined stillness. Harrison's lead attorney, a man with a booming voice and a condescending sneer, spent the morning systematically dismantling Samuel Reed's character. He produced manufactured evidence suggesting Reed was a drinker, a gambler, a man deep in debt. He portrayed the journal not as a record of a crime, but as the bitter fantasy of a failed partner looking to blame a better man for his own inadequacies. "This entire case," the lawyer thundered, gesturing to Abigail and Finch, "is built upon the ramblings in a diary, a piece of fiction found by a desperate woman looking for a payday." When it was Finch's turn, he did not begin with bluster. He began by calling Abigail to the stand. She walked to the witness box, her heart pounding. She wore her best dress, a simple calico that she had mended a dozen times. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Finch's questions were simple. He had her describe her life, the foreclosure, the desperation that had led them to the train car. He had her describe the moment of discovery. "Miss Abigail," Finch said, his voice gentle. "Mr. Harrison's lawyer claims you are doing this for money. Is that true?" Abigail looked from Finch to the jury, and then directly at Thomas Harrison. "A month ago, Mr. Harrison offered me $20,000 for that journal," she said, her voice clear and strong. "That's more money than I have ever seen. It would have solved all my problems." I said no. The murmur went through the courtroom. "Why?" Finch asked. "Because it wasn't my story to sell," she replied. "It belongs to Mr. Reed. It belongs to the families your father ruined, Mr. Harrison. All I'm doing is what Mr. Reed couldn't. I'm delivering his message." She spoke with such simple, unadorned honesty that the room fell silent. She was not a schemer, she was a messenger. Then Finch played his final card. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims this journal is a work of fiction. But Samuel Reed was a meticulous man. He did not just document the crime, he gathered corroborating evidence." Finch walked back to his table and retrieved the steel box, which had been entered as evidence. From it, he pulled out not a ledger but a thin sheaf of papers held together with a pin. "These are signed and notarized affidavits," Finch announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "From 2 bank clerks and a freight master, all of whom Alastair Harrison either threatened or bribed to conceal his activities. Samuel Reed convinced them to write down the truth, promising to keep these confessions safe until he could guarantee their protection. He kept his promise." He handed the affidavits to the bailiff. Harrison's composure finally shattered. He surged to his feet, his face pale with fury, before being pulled back down by his lawyer. The foundation of lies was crumbling. And then, the courtroom doors opened. Clay stood there, flanked by 2 territorial marshals. "Your Honor," Finch said, a note of surprise in his own voice. "The defense calls an unscheduled witness." Clay walked to the stand, his gaze fixed on Harrison. He swore the oath, and then he began to speak, his voice devoid of emotion, as he detailed Thomas Harrison's explicit instructions to him, to retrieve the journal at any cost, to intimidate the women, to burn the train car, to ensure the secret was kept buried. The dam had broken. The truth, 30 years delayed, was finally flooding the room. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The court, armed with the journal, the ledgers, the affidavits, and Clay's damning testimony, ruled decisively against the Harrison estate. The judgment was monumental. The court ordered the seizure of Harrison assets equivalent to the total amount stolen, adjusted for 30 years of growth, a sum that effectively dismantled the empire built on Alastair Harrison's crime. A trust was established, administered by the territorial court and overseen by Arthur Finch, to locate and compensate the descendants of the original depositors Samuel Reed had died trying to protect. As the agents of the discovery, and for their courage in protecting the evidence against immense pressure, the court awarded Abigail and Martha a substantial portion of the recovered funds. It was a sum that was difficult for Abigail to even comprehend. They were no longer just secure, they were wealthy. But as they stood on the courthouse steps, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, the victory felt like something far deeper than money. Thomas Harrison was ruined, his name a synonym for fraud. Arthur Finch had cleared his family's name, lifting a shadow that had darkened 3 generations. Reporters swarmed them, but Abigail and Martha simply made their way to their wagon, their faces etched with a quiet, profound peace. They returned not to a shack or a sod house, but to the train car. It sat waiting for them, a silent, rusted witness. Over the next few months, their lives transformed. They bought back their family land, not as desperate tenants, but as owners. They hired stonemasons to build a proper fieldstone house on a hill overlooking the valley. But they did not abandon the train car. Instead, they hired craftsmen to begin a meticulous restoration. It was not to be their home, but a monument. The peeling paint was stripped away to reveal the strong steel beneath. The shattered windows were replaced with new glass. The tarnished brass was polished until it gleamed like gold in the setting sun. One evening, as the project was nearing completion, Abigail and Martha stood in the open doorway of the car, looking out as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. The interior was now beautiful, the seats reupholstered in deep blue velvet, the mahogany panels glowing with a warm, rich luster. It looked as it must have to Samuel Reed, a place of safety and purpose. "Mama," Abigail said softly, her voice filled with a lingering sense of wonder. "Is this really ours? The house, the land, all of it?" Martha was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the endless prairie. She had aged, but the past few months had erased the lines of fear and desperation from her face, leaving behind a serene strength. She placed her wrinkled hand over Abigail's. "The house and the land are ours, yes," she said, her voice raspy but clear as a bell. "But this," she said, patting the beautifully restored doorframe of the carriage, "this is different. We were just the keepers. The ones who were desperate enough to find it, and brave enough to listen to it." She turned to her daughter, her faded eyes shining with a deep, knowing light. "No, dear," she said. "This doesn't belong to us. Now, it belongs to everyone." The train car stood not as a symbol of a private fortune found, but as a public testament to a truth unearthed, a promise that even the longest buried injustices could one day be brought into the light. It was Samuel Reed's final message, delivered at last.